Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a sort of book review on Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, you probably know that Hilary Mantel just released the final book in her Thomas Cromwell Trilogy, The Mirror and the Light, earlier this year. And so after hearing everybody's really positive reception to that, I decided to reread Wolf Hall and fully commit to the series. So I reread Wolf Hall this past month and I loved it. I rated it 5 stars. The first time I read Wolf Hall, I understood it was good. I could see what she was doing and I really appreciated it. But this time I was truly blown away, not just by her prose and her characterization, but by what I think is her deep understanding of the time period and the mindset of people living at that time. So something that really stuck out to me on this read through was religion, and so that's what I'm going to kind of theme my review around. Certainly this was not the only element of the book that I enjoyed. Like I said, I rated it 5 stars, so I loved literally everything. But this was a component of the story that I found myself thinking about whenever I wasn't reading the book. And it's certainly been occupying my mind since I finished Wolf Hall. I hope to give an unbiased perspective here, though I am Protestant, so I suspect some of this book spoke to me in a way that maybe it wouldn't have if you were Catholic, if you were atheist, or if you were of another faith. So I'm going to do what I can to stay unbiased, but just know that's the perspective I'm coming in on. I am Protestant. So Wolf Hall is clearly Thomas Cromwell's story. I think Hilary Mantel does a really great job at rehabilitating his image and really providing a very nuanced perspective on him. And he's a figure who I've always been fairly interested in because even in Tudor nonfiction, but mostly in historical fiction, he is a character on the periphery of the action. He's someone whose motives you were never entirely sure of. And I think that she did something really unique here and tried to make him a character that you felt like you could root for in some instances. But I think in order to give Thomas Cromwell an edge, she very much villainized Thomas More. Now, Thomas More is a name that I'm familiar with because of Richard III. He wrote sort of a history of Richard III that went unpublished in his lifetime, so it was published posthumously. And it is a pretty big source for Shakespeare's Richard III, and I believe to a certain extent the Henry VI plays. And so if you've read those, you can probably understand the attitude that Thomas More had in his Richard III history. And so you can imagine I have complicated feelings about him. But there's a lot of argument about that work. I mean, because it was published posthumously, there are a lot of people who say, was it true? Was he scared to publish this because he knew it was true and people didn't want to acknowledge this is what happened? And then there are also people who say, well, he left it unpublished because it wasn't good and he knew it was promoting a harmful ideal or it was promoting an untruth. But anyways, we're not here for that. I just knew a little bit about Thomas More before I came into Wolf Hall, but I was really shocked at how much we got to learn about him throughout the course of this novel. Like I said, the portrayal of him in Wolf Hall is fairly villainous, and in fact, I think if you were to name maybe the overarching conflict or the overarching villain of the book, you would name Thomas More. And so you can imagine my surprise when I gave him kind of a cursory Google after finishing Wolf Hall, and I found out for a lot of people, he ranks as a saint. He is actually a saint in the Catholic canon. And frankly, by the end of this book, I felt so sorry for him that I forgot his portrayal in the rest of the book. I forgot that he was involved with the torture and execution of many Protestants. I think it's a bit early to call them Protestants, but he was certainly involved in some fairly dastardly deeds. Still, I ended the book with a great deal of respect for him because, spoilers here, I'm gonna spoil Wolf Hall and how it ends. The book ends with his execution because he refused to acknowledge Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. He really refused to recognize his divorce with Catherine of Aragon as well, and that essentially got him executed. He was given multiple chances to renege and to agree and to swear an oath. He just didn't do it. And I have to respect somebody like that. I have to respect somebody with principles who believes in something, even though throughout the rest of the novel, he did a lot of things that were truly monstrous and that clearly you as the reader were never meant to agree with. At the end, he held a lot of emotion for me, and I was actually fairly upset by his death and by how he died, I think mostly because he appeared to be so principled. It's for this reason that he's viewed as a martyr by Catholic communities, and I think the novel really gave it some nuance and made it incredibly emotional, even though throughout the book More burned people for so-called heretical thinking, and he really disparaged Thomas Cromwell for his poor background. And I think this is a good segue into talking about how Wolf Hall discussed religion. I think for many of us, Henry VIII is a figure that we at least know by name, but if we know a little bit more than that, we know probably two main things about him: that he had 6 wives, and that he created the Church of England. I also think the Protestant Reformation itself is regularly boiled down to Martin Luther and Henry VIII, and this book never allowed it to be that simple, which I really, really appreciated. Now, I do think it leaned Protestant, mostly because Cromwell was a bit of a reformer. He was someone who did a lot in the way of making sure we got the first standardized English Bible. And so I think since the book was from his perspective, that was kind of the attitude it took. And so by default, I think Thomas More was forced into a very difficult place in the narrative. Thomas More was a lawyer, and for a large portion of Wolf Hall, he occupied the post of Lord High Chancellor of England, but he is mostly known today for a book called Utopia. It is many things: a social and political commentary, a satire, and in its own way, it's almost a fantasy. More himself was, as Wolf Hall blatantly puts on the page, against the Protestant Reformation and against Henry's separation from Rome and his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. It was this, along with refusing to attend Anne Boleyn's coronation and blatantly refusing to recognize Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, that eventually led to his arrest and execution. In Wolf Hall, what seems to be the major moment is his refusing to take the oath of supremacy, i.e. recognizing Henry as the head of the Church of England. This was essentially abjuring the Pope and all of his power and recognizing that Catherine of Aragon's relationship and marriage with Henry VIII was annulled. And so, of course, you can imagine this went against everything that he believed as a Catholic. And the scenes in the book that were focused on this were absolutely incredible. And I don't think that you could walk away from it not having respect for him, or at least kind of forgetting about what came earlier. And what came earlier was brutal. Thomas More spent a good deal of Wolf Hall persecuting people with Protestant leanings well before there was any true discussion of Henry separating from Rome. Some of perhaps the most moving passages of the book had to deal with William Tyndale, who was a scholar most famous for his incomplete translation of the Bible into English. There would just be sentences talking about people hiding mere pages of his translation, dying for their right to read it, even being warned and saying, "You'll get off this once if you stop reading this stuff." And they went back and did it again, and then they were executed. And some of those executions came at the hands of Thomas More. For me, this was brutal. It was emotional. It was very eye-opening, and I think it was small sections like this that really pushed me to give the book 5 stars. Now, it's important to note that Tyndale's translation, while very important historically, it was not the first translation or attempted translation of the Bible into English. There was a very famous partial translation also by a guy named John Wycliffe from the 1300s, and possessing a copy of that also led to persecution and possible execution. Still, there's a lot of Tyndale in our modern English translations, and a lot of phrases that have come to have a great deal of spiritual meaning, such as "let there be light," were first translated in that way by William Tyndale. His translation was banned for a wide variety of reasons. Some of those pertain to Catholic thinkers who thought he deliberately translated things in a way to seem anti-clergy, anti-saint, and just in general heretical. And he did change key words that show up in Catholic doctrine to those that we might recognize today and associate more with Protestantism. Much of what he wrote became the foundation of the Great Bible, which was the first authorized English Bible that actually came a little bit later in Henry VIII's reign. So I thought it would be interesting to read the first few verses from Tyndale's translation of the Bible. And so I'm going to show how they're written here, and you can just follow along with me. And I think you'll see how much of Tyndale has come into modern English translations. So these are verses 1 through 6 of Genesis. "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the water. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness, and called the light day, and the darkness night. And so of the evening and morning was made the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament between the waters, and let it divide the waters asunder. Apart from the very distinct Tudor spelling, I think that's a very recognizable translation of the first few verses of Genesis. And I also wanted to read a quote from around the last quarter of the book, and that I think sums up this issue and really argues quite eloquently for the English Bible and for the right to understand things yourself. As these teachings gain ground and continue disseminating, despite the glaring punishment you might endure if you were found with a chapter of Tyndale or something of Luther's, Cromwell considers it. As the word of God spreads, the people's eyes are open to new truths. Until now, they knew Noah and the flood, but not St. Paul. They could count over the sorrows of our Blessed Mother and say how the damned are carried down to hell, but they did not know the manifold miracles and sayings of Christ, nor the words and deeds of the apostles, simple men who, like the poor of London, pursued simple, wordless trades. The story is much bigger than they ever thought it was. He says to his nephew Richard, you cannot tell people just part of the tale and then stop, or just tell them the parts you choose. They have seen their religion painted on the walls of churches or carved in stone. But now God's pen is poised, and he is ready to write his words in the books of their hearts. So much else went on regarding religion in this book, and I think we were allowed to see both sides of it quite well through figures like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More, Catherine of Aragon, Princess Mary. We met characters who died because they couldn't stop reading the Bible in English. We met characters who staunchly refused to acknowledge anything but the Catholic Church. And it led to a lot of personal reflection for me. As a Protestant, I wonder if I would have had the courage some of these men had. Would I have tried to continue reading and learning if I knew what the punishment might be? Would I even have attempted that in the first place? And of course, this is supposing that I was a man living at the time and not a woman, because I assume I wouldn't have had a particular opinion either way. I probably wouldn't have been educated enough. Still, it makes me appreciative of so much, because I certainly don't have to fight for my right to read a religious text of any kind or a book of any kind, let alone the translation it comes in. These people did. And it's a part of the Protestant Reformation that I think gets overlooked, probably because of the larger wars of religion that broke out later in the 1500s. Those certainly overshadowed these kind of minor conflicts. For me, Wolf Hall looked at this not only from the point of view of a person like the Pope or someone like Henry VIII, it allowed you to see the ordinary person's perspective. And Thomas More may not necessarily be a common man, but certainly you were given the perspective of many women in London and in England as a whole who stood up for Catherine of Aragon, and they certainly were ordinary. Tyndale was a scholar on the level of More, but we were allowed to see his side through Cromwell and through his family specifically. I'd like to finish this video up with Thomas More's final words: "The king's good servant, but God's first." I think this quote sums up why religion as a theme was so important in Wolf Hall. You feel like the book is revolving around Henry or Anne or Cromwell scheming, and thus that Henry's break from Rome is the real religious conflict. But I believe this quote shows that Henry might have been a catalyst or even a cog in the machine. But the true conflict and the true conversation is about God and how you interact with him. Do you need an intermediary? Is it heretical to want to read religious teachings in your own language? Is this change ultimately bad? Will this result in a massive fraction of the church as we know it? God was coming first for either side of this divide, Protestant or Catholic, and Henry came second. It just so happened that his desires and those of many others lined up. I would love to know your opinions on Wolf Hall and how it discussed religion down below. I'd love to hear just your opinion on Wolf Hall in general and the series as a whole, because I absolutely loved it. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.